Thanks, everybody. Thanks for giving up your time to participate again. So this is the second webinar in the soil test series. And once again, our presenter is David Hardwick. And the topics we're going to be dealing with this evening are soil tests and soil health, using soil tests to monitor soil health, and organic matter, carbon to nitrogen ratio, soil pH, and sodic soils. Once again, is it actually on? Oh, there we go. How's that? That's a bit better. These webinars are supported by Southern Gulf NRM through funding from the federal government's National Landcare program. So it's coming under two different projects that I'm managing: the Profitable Producers Creating Healthy Landscapes project and the EB Smart Farm project. Once again, we've got a casual workshop style, so I do like everyone to chit-chat and, well, to a degree. David will control things, and imagine that we are in a room together. So the key presentation will be completed by 8:30, or this is the longer one, isn't it, David? So it might go a little bit over. Okay, thank you. For those interested, some further discussion can continue. Please mute yourself unless you're asking questions. And once again, the webinar is being recorded. Before I hand over to David, just a few reminders. We have got the erosion control field days and on-property on-site recommendations by Daryl Hill coming up. So Wyangaree at Richmond is the critical one for your area. The next big event is the Redcliffe Field Day at Redcliffe on the 19th of August. So if everyone wants to put that one into your diaries. And we also have coming up after those is some pasture recovery workshops, field days. And I do have the presenter that's coming to those field days is also going to feature at the Redcliffe days. So he will be looking at some of the metrograss and just pasture response there, particularly as that was brought up by the Innovation Hub Group. And Frank, I thought we also might take Trevor out to that paddock that you've got issues with and show him that paddock and see if we can get some recommendations. Basically, that's it. So now I'll hand over to you then, David, if you'd like to share your screen. I'll just take mine off. So yours should be right to load.
Yep. Thanks for that, Anne.
Righto. Thanks,
G'day,
David.
No worries. G'day, everyone. I'll get myself sorted out here. Get that screen going. Get this screen going. Get my chat going. All right. Welcome to webinar 2. Thanks for coming back. Tonight was a little bit longer than the normal ones just because soil health's a little bit of a bigger topic, but I'll jump into it because I don't want to be too late for everyone. And if you do have issues or questions, please just put your hand up. I'll try and catch it out of the side of my eye because I've got you guys on the other screen. Or just jump in, just turn your mic on and jump in if there's a burning question. That's all good. Those of you that can't get on the video because of the connection or whatever, or you're wearing pajamas, all good. Just give us the thumbs up every now and again to make sure I know you're not dead. You're technically alive. So yeah, just give us the thumbs up. That'll be all good. And Jeff, if you drink too many beers on soil nights, what happens is, no, we did it. We did an experiment a couple of weeks ago, didn't we? And a few people were knocking back beers while I was talking about CEC, which was impressive because they kept awake. So I was impressed, especially after they had a full day out, sorting cattle. So that was pretty good. All right, well, we'll jump straight into it, everyone. So hopefully you can see the screen all right. And there's a couple of cane guys down in the Airhome Hill area that are reading soil tests with their magnifying glass, which is always a bit torturous. But yeah, they're just learning again to read that test and make decisions. So I'll jump in. What we did last time, just as a refresher, we looked at sort of why you'd use soil tests and the key sort of tips to getting the most out of them. Sample properly, use them holistically, benchmark carefully. You know, there was a couple of golden rules that I went over. And then the key things to remember when using them. And then finally, we just started to practice using soil tests by looking at soil type. And so we use a soil test for 3 reasons: to understand soil type, to dig a bit deeper and, not just brown shit or sticky black stuff or whatever, or white crap. We get a bit deeper, and we looked at total fertility, texture, and the CEC, or that charge in your soil. And then tonight we're using it to look at soil health, and next week we'll touch on nutrients. We'll look at phosphorus and sulfur. So they're the 3 main reasons that you'd use a soil test to help you with decisions. And if you remember, and I'm just going to grab a soil test to go over this again, but if you remember, all good soil tests have these 5 elements on them. So even if you get a test from a different lab, or someone shows you a different test that looks a bit different, they should have these sort of 5 parts to them. And I'll just grab a soil test and we can go over that. So here's an example of a test, just a different area, but it's a single test, so I thought it'd be easy to use. But hang on, and my Zoom's gone a bit crazy. So all tests pretty much have these, good tests have 5 parts to them. The first thing is they have these things called indicators, or sometimes parameters. So like here we've got pH and salinity and nitrogen and phosphorus. So the different indicators, we call them. So a good test will have a good complete set of indicators that are relevant for your management questions. The second thing a test will have on it is the method, the way they measured the test. So how did they measure pH, which is here? They used a 1 to 5 water method. So there's different ways to measure different aspects of soil. So in this case, they measured it with 1 to 5 water. So a good test will tell you the reference method, just so that you compare apples with apples in the future. And then the other thing that a soil test has on it is the unit of measurement, in this case, milligrams per kilogram. And does anyone remember what the equivalent unit of measurement is to milligrams per kilogram? So there's another unit of measurement that's exactly the same, that's commonly used. Anyone want to have a crack? You can either put it into chat or parts per million. Thanks, Jeff. So ppm, if you see ppm or parts per million, sorry, my online writing's not the best, but if you see ppm, then that means milligrams per kilogram. But sometimes you'll see percentage, like organic matter, or salinity is measured in something really different called decisiemens per meter. And there's different ways things are measured. But yeah, so every good test will put on it the units of measurement, so it's really clear to you which unit they're using. Are they talking centimeters or meters or kilometers? The other thing that's on a test, of course, is your results. And you can see on the EAL test that most of you have, the results are in this column here. So they're in the results column. And then I'll just get that up there, the results columns here. And the final thing that soil tests have is they have these benchmarks on them. So on the EAL test, if you've got one of them, then you can see that they call them indicative guidelines. But other tests call them slightly different things, but a good test will have some kind of benchmarking on it for you. So that's sort of the way that tests are laid out. I'll just sort of work out what's happened to my screen here. Things have gone a bit haywire. Oh, here we go. So all good tests have those things on them, those 5 things on them. And so when we're looking at soil tests, we're trying to just make sense of a test. Just remember that those 5 parts. And so soil type is the texture, the total fertility, and that soil charge that we talked about, which is called CEC. So I'm just going to try and get a soil up for you. Just bear with me a minute. So I'll get your soils up if I can make it work. Here we go. So these are the Hughenden group soils for you guys. So we've got the properties up the top. So hopefully you've got a copy of your soil test, which will be hopefully on this spreadsheet. So I'm just going to I'm on the side looking at the parameters down the side here at these parameters, and soil type is really 3 things. The first thing is it's the totals. And if you remember, we explored total phosphorus, total calcium, total sulfur, and we kind of compared soils. We've got total phosphorus of 325 here, total phosphorus of 77 in that second soil. So very different overall levels of phosphorus, and that's down to the minerals, the mineral composition. And the second part of your soil type, as just a quick refresher, is that that thing called the CEC, which is about halfway down your test. And I just touched on it, but the jargon we use is cation exchange capacity, or CEC. And you guys mostly have quite large charges, 41, 48, 54. So it's kind of an electrical charge on the surface of the clay in your soil, as well as the humus or the organic matter, which we'll go into tonight. But this soil over here was 4.1. So you can see it has quite a different charge on it, or CEC. And it's not really something that you worry about when you're grazing landscapes, because you're not going to change it. But if you are cropping or thinking to do forage crops, it does become relevant because it influences liming and fertilizer rates and a few things like that. So we looked at that. And then the final thing we looked at was texture, which is the feel of the soil, how much sand, silt and clay is in the soil. And on this particular test, you can see they put the texture sort of near the bottom, just above the totals, and it gave you a basic texture. So if everyone can find that, you can see the basic texture sort of towards the bottom there. So that's, and then we've got clay loam, clay loam, clay loam. Looks like they just cut and paste. So you can measure your texture in the paddock, and that's probably the better way to do it. And that's with what's called the ribbon test, where you make a sausage out of the soil. And Anne can send you a link to the video that we've made on that for dry tropics, on how to test the texture of your soil in the paddock. It's probably a more accurate way, believe it or not, to do it than sometimes getting it done by the lab, unless you're paying the lab a fair bit of money. So that's kind of the three parts to soil type. And so instead of saying soils are, you know, sticky brown stuff or whatever, they're really, have they got a lot of overall fertility, or a little bit, or a moderate? What's their texture, and what's the size of the charge in them, really, the simple relevant ones. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to jump in and look at this idea of soil health, my favorite term, because it's the most widely woolly word you'll ever hear. If I go to the pub and you tell me, Dave, my soil's healthy, I'm just going to feel really warm and fuzzy for you, but that doesn't mean anything. What we want to know is what's the specifics of that, and how is it relevant to me managing my landscapes. And so we're going to look at some key aspects of soil health: organic matter, what I call the carbon to nitrogen ratio, which we'll go into, and pH. We'll probably only have time for those three, maybe even two. We'll see how we go. And we're going to practice reading this soil test. So let's get into soil health. So here's a vehicle. You guys are looking to buy a second-hand vehicle, and you've rung me up and you've said, yeah, I've heard you've got a vehicle on Gumtree. I'm interested in it. And I've told you on the phone that it's in good nick, but you trust me about as far as you can throw me, because you've never met me and I sound a bit dodgy. So you're going to come out and have a look at the vehicle. You're going to inspect it. So you come out to have a look at it, and this is what you rock up and see. So what's on your checklist when you're going to buy a second-hand vehicle, which is an asset for the business? What's on your checklist? What are you going to inspect when you get there to have a look at the vehicle? What's in your mental checklist that you're going to make sure is in working order? So if anyone wants to punch in any ideas to chat about what you'd actually look at on the vehicle before you part with $20,000, which is what I'm offering for that. Yeah, Tanil, no worries. I'll give you a roadworthy, no problem at all. I just put a case of beer on the back seat and go into the main roads. Sorry, not supposed to do that anymore. Yep, but yeah, so wheels, engine, yeah, well, that's, in this case, you'd be looking under the bonnet and you wouldn't even see an engine. So it's a bit of a drastic situation, unless you really want to do a reno. But yeah, there's a list there, isn't there? Like body condition, black smoke, gearbox, windscreen. You're going to go through a checklist. What is the condition of this vehicle? And if I'm offering you 10 grand and you say, mate, I'll give you 200 for it, there's a bit of a checklist that you're going to go through. You're not really going to worry about how much fuel's in the tank, because you can fix that later on. At the moment, you're going to worry about what condition is the asset in. Is it in working order? because you can put fuel in the tank. That's a separate issue, and you can fix that quite readily. But you can't, if there's wheels and an engine missing, then the asset's just not going to function. So there's no point putting fuel in the tank. And so no matter what type of vehicle it is, you want to know it's in working order and can do a job for you. That's the key thing. If this is a business asset, you want it to do a job for you. And with vehicles like utes and farm vehicles, really what we want them to do is carry loads, get to town and back, go to Townsville if needed, carry passengers, tow trailers, etc. So we want them to do a range of things. And the really important thing about any farm asset or property asset is that you want it to be able to do its job reliably in both easy and challenging times. And this is the really important thing, because it's easy to grow grass in a good year. Everyone can grow grass when there's a good year. The difficulty is growing grass in a tough year, and that's where soils differentiate themselves. That in a poor year, you get grass growth because the soil's in really good condition. But it's easy to grow grass in a good year. Everyone can do it on most soils. So if you think about your topsoil as an asset, just like that vehicle, it's one of your farm business's most important capital assets. When you buy property, you're pretty much buying topsoil and vegetation, and maybe some agricultural infrastructure like fencing and watering, etc. And it's part of what we call your natural capital. And you need to keep that asset in good condition for it to work, to be productive for you. So just like the vehicle or fencing, you need to keep the topsoil in working order. And that's pretty much what we mean by soil health. Soil health just means a topsoil in good condition, in working order. And so there's a couple of things that a topsoil will do for your grazing business when it's in good condition. And I'm just going to quickly go over them before we jump in and start looking at a soil test. So the first thing that a topsoil in good condition will do is capture as much water as possible. So when rain falls and hits the ground, it only has two places it can go. It can go into the soil or it can run off. And the best place for it to go is obviously into the soil. So a healthy soil has what we call good structure, and it will have a high infiltration rate for rainfall. And to give you some perspective on the difference between a poor conditioned soil and a good conditioned soil, or if we use the grazing land management terminology, A-class country and D-class country, the work done on planned or rotational grazing, whatever term you want to use, done in the early 2000s when they did the first of the pretty good scientific trials around it, showed that you can, over 3 years, one research site done in northern South Australia in really low rainfall country found that over 3 years, set stocking versus planned grazing, the planned grazing landscape increased its water infiltration by 10-fold over 3 years. So that's 10 times more water went in the ground during rainfall events compared to the set stocking area. So that's a really big difference, especially in a 400 mil rainfall area. So that's the first benefit. The second real benefit that a healthy topsoil or a good conditioned topsoil gives you is it cycles any nutrients much more efficiently. You can have all the phosphorus in the world in your soil, but if it's like that soil, that paddock, that grass on the left, it's not cycling that phosphorus, so it's not really functional. And so this is that picture of the perennial grass cut to different recovery times, cut every week, cut every 2 weeks, cut every 4 weeks. And you can see just giving that perennial grass some recovery time means it can build a root system, and that bigger root system, more carbon, more water will mean you'll have better nutrient cycling. The third thing that a healthy soil does, it's pretty general, is it provides a healthy or an optimal environment for plant roots to thrive. So if you need perennial grass roots to really thrive, they need structure, they need a balanced environment, biologically active, and that's what a healthy soil provides. And the last one, which is not so relevant for you guys, but it is if you're cropping, is that a healthy soil has a diverse community of life in it, and it will regulate pests in the ground. So pests and diseases of crops, sugarcane's a classic example. Nematodes can knock out 40 tonnes, up to 40 tonnes of yield potential. That's a lot of yield potential loss. And just getting some diversity and soil health back, you can minimise or eliminate that nematode damage through nothing but some diversity in the rotation. So a balanced soil, healthy soil, can minimise that loss that you get from soil biology impacts, pathogens. And the final thing, which might sound a little bit indirect, but it's actually really important, is that a healthy topsoil means that you get a much more healthy landscape more broadly. And the specifics around that is lower temperature at surface. And like I've measured soils up that way over the years in early summer and late summer, when I'm usually up there sort of from, well, I go up in July usually and start working there until sort of the end of the year, and then kick off again in February. And we've often measured 65 to 70 degrees bare ground surface temperature. And in fact, you can measure 3 centimeters below ground on hot bare ground, and you'll have 55 degrees 3 centimeters below the ground. That's composting temperature. So the problem with that hot temperature is that most of your soil biology and the root zones don't like living in that, so it's just not a good environment. But the second thing is evaporation of water. So you're losing most of your soil moisture just up into the air. So that's the second thing. And the third problem with that is that the carbon in the organic matter is being oxidized and just going back up in the air as CO2. So it's a triple whammy. So that's why ground cover is so important, and mulch layer and close grass cover. Less dust, less erosion, less extreme runoff events, and you also get more soil insects going on, and that means more bird life and all of those sort of ecosystem functions, which actually are really important for everyone, including the cattle and us. So yeah, you get a healthy landscape. So no matter what soil type you're on, whether you're on black country, sandy country, brigalow, doesn't really matter, Mitchell grass downs, doesn't matter where you are and what country you're on, all your soil types need to be kept in good condition. And so that's really what I mean when I'm saying soil health. If you want to make money out of them in the long term, then you need to keep them in good condition. So that's what we're going to do now, is go through a checklist to see what's on the soil asset checklist, so like we looked at the vehicle checklist. So does anyone want to have a go from what you know of soils? What should be on a checklist when we're assessing the condition of a topsoil to see what condition it's in? See if you can think of one or two things that you want to be checking. And this soil here, this picture here is an example for you. This is the same soil type. These are side by side. This is a trial in Victoria. And so it's the same soil type, same fertility, but it's just one of them's got a treatment to try and improve soil health. So ground cover, yep, Jeff, that ground cover is king. If there's nothing else that you worry about in life up in your area of the world, ground cover is all that keeps it simple. Population per metre, particularly if you preferred perennials, for sure, Jeff. Yeah, because that perennial grass is really building a topsoil, a really healthy grassland topsoil. So ground cover, preferred perennials per square metre, that's another really good one. Structure, you can see here this soil's got what we call structure compared to this one. And there's a few other things too, but basically like a vehicle, there's a checklist you can go through to see if your vehicle or your soil is in working order and does it need improving or where's it at. And so this is a basic checklist that I've just thrown at you there. And the first one is soil pH, which is the kind of acid or alkalinity of a soil. The second one is salinity. These are not in any order of importance. I've flipped them around actually. The third one, which we're not going to touch on in this course just because it's a short course, is what we call cation balancing. And the last two, which are probably the most important two, as well as ground cover for grazing landscapes, is how much organic matter or carbon you have in your soil, and the thing we call the carbon-nitrogen ratio, which sounds mysterious, but basically it's just the digestibility of your soil organic matter. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with that word, digestibility. When we're talking cattle feed, you look at a paddock and you go, righto, is it good digestibility or poor digestibility? What's the protein content? What's the fiber content in the grass? And it's the same in the soil. You can have lots of organic matter that's quite poorly decomposing because it's too woody basically. So we're going to explore that because that has pretty big impacts for paddocks. So let's jump into it. And first of all, look at soil organic matter or carbon. They're used interchangeably, those words. I'm just going to stick on organic matter today. So let's jump in and see how we can use a soil test. A really quick refresher on organic matter. Where does it come from? So organic matter starts with photosynthesis, and plants grab carbon from the air. They fix carbon out of the air from CO2. And if you can see on that diagram, they take up water and nutrients. I've missed the nutrients there, but they take up water and nutrients from the soil. So plants take up water and nutrients and they grab carbon out of the air and they combine the two, and that's plant biomass. So as plants grow, they create biomass, which is nutrients from the soil and carbon from the air through photosynthesis. So that's why people bang on about photosynthesis. And you can see that that plant on the right is creating a lot more biomass than that plant on the left. And the second thing you can see is that plant biomass is created above ground, the stuff that we all worry about, as well as underground, the stuff that soil nerds worry about. So both of them are really important, the above ground biomass and the below ground biomass. So we've got two forms of biomass, and as that gets shed by the plant, so roots get shed off into the soil after grazing or fire, and leaf and litter falls on the ground, leaf fall from trees, a dead log falls over, all of that stuff, as soon as it leaves a living plant, it becomes soil organic matter. At that point, it belongs to the soil. And so through time, that biomass is fed back to the soil as litter and mulch on the surface and dead roots underground. And if you look carefully at this photo here, this is actually a sugarcane paddock near Gordonvale in North Queensland just this last year. And the guys cleared that country. It's just under the pyramid, if you know the Pyramid Mountain. But they cleared that country for cane about 30 years ago. And you can see where they pushed the timber down to make the cane field. Everyone see the log at that level down there, and you can see it's a dark layer, so it's a typical topsoil layer down there, and they probably burnt it too, so there's probably charcoal through there as well. So that was the original topsoil, and then the guys pushed around soil for drainage, so they had to make, because it's a wet tropics, drainage is king, so they had to push soil around sort of thing to make the new paddock and get it draining right. So you can see they've pushed subsoil on top of the old topsoil, which was the high organic matter layer. And then now there's a new layer, as you can see that sort of grey area up here of topsoil forming. So that new layer of soil organic topsoil is from the cane and the other cover crops and just recontributing biomass to the ground. So what happens to organic matter? Because it contains carbon and nutrients, just remember it's got energy and nutrients in it, just like what cows are chasing, is that as organic matter or plant biomass hits the soil, it gets eaten. Microbes, soil life, all the insects in the soil, they just eat it because they're chasing energy and nutrients just like cows are and just like us. So that's what happens. It gets decomposed. All the life in the soil says, this is a bit of food, I'm going to eat it. And they're chasing their energy and nutrients. And you can see here, this is calico strips that we've put in the ground. It's not an easy photo to take, calico strips, but these are strips of calico, which is cotton, obviously, and you can see that these two have been eaten or decomposed much faster than them. So just depending on how active the soil is, the community is, but they're just decomposing it. And so soil organic matter is really important because it helps with soil structure, it helps with nutrient cycling, and it helps with water holding capacity. So actually, soil organic matter is, wherever you are on planet Earth, soil organic matter is actually probably the common denominator for a soil that makes a soil function well or poorly. Whether you're in agriculture or the rainforest or just natural savanna country, it doesn't matter. Organic matters are really key to the whole system, if you like. And this is a vanilla paddock, and I'll show you their soil test in a minute. This is a vanilla paddock, again, near Mirrawinny, just south of Cairns there. And over here is where the vanilla's growing in the beds, like horticulture beds. And over here is just the mowed grass a metre away. And this is 28 to 30% organic matter, and this over here would be lucky if it's 5%, maybe 5%. So just through management, you can see very different levels of organic matter. And so those areas of soil are behaving differently. So the big question is, do I have enough? Well, let's find out. Let's get into our soil test. So what you're looking for now, so grab your test if you've got it. I'll pull one up in a minute. You're just looking on your soil test and see if you can find the organic matter indicator. So something on your soil test that tells you about organic matter, if you can find it. I'll get up your tests. So when you find it, bury your undies. Yeah, Jeff, that's what the cotton industry come up with. They got that from some hipsters in America that had that, and you just go out with undies. But the problem is you've got to wash the undies, because if you don't wash them, then it increases the rate of decomposition, because you've got more nutrients on them. So yeah, you've got to standardize it and make it scientific. You've got to wash the undies in bleach. All right, so has everyone found the organic matter on their soil test? So it's up near the top of the test. It's sort of about a quarter of the way down on the first page. So hopefully you can all see that estimated organic matter. So everyone got that? Give us the thumbs up. You guys that don't have a screen, hopefully you're following all right. I'm going at a pretty rapid rate. I do apologize, but it is a bit of a topic, soil health. So hopefully just pull me up if you need to. So Luke, Ali, everyone else, John and Susan, just pull me up. So yeah, everyone's found it. So you can see here that they measure it as a percentage, and you can also see that they calculate it, and I'll go over that in a minute. That's how they measure it, the method. And then you can see the result. So this first soil here, I'm not sure whose soil this is, number 1. We'll check it out in a minute. It's 4.4. The second soil is 1.0% organic matter. These soils over here, number 4 is 0.84. And I have a feeling that that soil is a very different soil type. It's the soil with the very small CEC, if I remember myself correctly. So you can see that different soils have different levels of organic matter, and that's all down to soil type and management, basically. So that first soil was Africa 1, Africa 2, and then over here Africa 4, which I'm pretty sure is that very different. Oh no, it's not. It's still a heavy soil. So I'll just give you a bit of an insight how they actually estimate organic matter, which might make sense, help it make sense to you a bit more. So what they actually do to work out organic matter, they actually measure carbon. So if you go down to your second page, sort of just above your totals, you'll see this total carbon. Everyone see this total carbon that's been measured, and you'll see that what they actually do, well, this lab uses a more modern technique than some labs. They put it through a very fancy analyzer machine, and they measure the total content of carbon. So you can see this soil has 2.5% carbon. This soil has 0.58% carbon in the topsoil sample. So then what they do, they go, okay, we know that soil organic matter contains carbon and nutrients from the plant, because remember, plant biomass has carbon plus nutrients, plus hydrogen and oxygen. So they then kind of do a multiplier. So sometimes people talk in terms of soil carbon like this, but other times people talk in terms of organic matter. So I'm going to just talk in terms of organic matter. But if you're hearing about soil carbon, or you're thinking about a soil carbon project or something, they measure carbon, but organic matter contains carbon plus nutrients, just like feed. If you think of cattle feed having energy and protein, it's the same with soil organic matter. It contains carbon and nutrients. So you guys can see some results on your soil test. We've got 4.4, we've got 0.84, we've got 1.4. I'll just show you a few other tests just to give you sort of some perspective. Here's some Northern Territory soils. So let's have a look at their organic matter. This is near Catherine on Rhodes grass and grazing. You can see here they've got 0.8, 1, and 0.9, and they're quite different soil types to yours. So these are not heavy clays. These are quite light, low fertility country near Catherine. Don't know if you remember, I said that the Northern Territory has 3 technical soil types: yellow shit, white shit, and red shit. So you can see here on their different soil types, they have quite low amounts of organic matter or carbon. And maybe I'll show you just another one. This is in the cold country of southern New South Wales, or central New South Wales, on the high country, the tablelands, near a place called Orange. And you can see pasture, perennial pastures, you can see its organic matter percent is 10%. And so higher rainfall, cooler, perennial grasses, good grazing management, not overgrazing, and you can see that it can store a lot more organic matter or carbon in the soil. And just one more, a Queensland coastal one up in the tropics to show you, which I've got tonight. I think it's that one there. Yes, Mose. So you can see here, this is an Atherton tablelands, south of Atherton there, going up into the really high part there. Tazali, if you know the area, and you can see here in the high country of the Atherton, 11% organic matter. So you can see that different soils have, I'll just make that a bit bigger for everyone, different soils have different levels of organic matter depending on rainfall, vegetation type, and management. They're the three big, and a bit of soil texture as well. Clay soils can hold a little bit more organic matter than sandy soils just because of the clay content. So you can see here there's a few things influencing organic matter content in soils. Any questions or comments? You guys have found your numbers, I hope. If I haven't got any feedback from you guys, that I'm just seeing the blank screen, so hopefully you're still awake, but give us the thumbs up if you want. But yeah, hopefully you guys can see your levels on your test. And so obviously when you have a number on a test, you've got to work out whether that number is good or bad. That's the key thing. So we've got a number, Dave. I've got 3% or 1%. What does it mean? Well, we only way we can make meaning of it is if we benchmark it. So now we've got to look at what's a benchmark. So if we have a look at your test results, you guys, here's your organic matter, which is row 21. And so there's a whole lot of different levels depending on the situation. We've got everything from 4.4 to 0.84 to 1.4. And I'll keep scrolling across and see what we've got. 4.4 again, 2.9, 2. So hopefully you've been able to find your results. But you can see over here on the right-hand side, the EAL gives you these benchmarks, and we've just touched on them previously. They call them indicative guidelines, and they give you a benchmark for it. So you can see here that according to EAL, if we trust their benchmark, if we think their benchmarks are relevant for us, then their benchmark for organic matter in heavy soils, these two are the heavy soil columns, is over 4.5, or really heavy clay, 5.5. So that's their generic benchmark. So obviously, we've got the first question we've got to ask ourselves is that benchmark relevant for our climate in Northern Australia and our rainfall? And just knowing the system, that benchmark's kind of a bit generic, but it is a bit of a starting point for us. But this is the tricky thing, is what is a relevant amount to have? I think it's really important to remember that organic matter helps you with water holding capacity. So the more of it you have, the better from that point of view. But you've also got to be realistic that in my rainfall climate, 8 months of hot, dry weather, how much can I realistically build and maintain for soil health and a good soil? So if that's the right benchmark, or we can look elsewhere for a benchmark. I'll give you another example because you can see this soil at Orange down in New South Wales, they've given the same benchmarks. And for the grazier near the Atherton tablelands, they've given the same benchmarks. So, we've got to make it a little bit more regionally specific. So I've done that for you guys. I've cooked up a little bit of a Dave's Dodgy benchmarks. No, I'm just kidding. I've tried to do the best I can. So I've given you these benchmarks here. So for northern cropping, by that I mean inland cropping, sort of opportunity forage crops or whatever in sort of your part of the world, or maybe a little bit to the east. So you can see 2% at least, and if you're in pastoral grazing landscapes, at least 2 or 3%. So if you're on the sandier country, then you may struggle to get over 3%. But if you're on the heavier clay soil with good perennial grasses, etc., a couple of good years of rainfall and good management, you should be able to at least get to that 3%. And well, that's what I've seen in different soil types up there, and I think that's realistic. And you can see that that's quite different than on the tablelands, the Atherton, where the rainfall is much higher. So even though the soils are not necessarily more fertile, so this is the soil at Tazali near Atherton, and if you have a look, it's 11% organic matter, and a bad soil organic matter in that part of the world is 8%. So if they have 8%, then they're not doing really well. So hopefully that kind of gives you a bit of perspective that if they're at 7-8%, they kind of score their organic matter low. If you guys were at 7 or 8%, you'd be well famous. You'd be on YouTube and everyone would be watching you, because it's just not going to happen in that climate. But, you know, if you got to 3 or 4%, it'd be a good outcome. So hopefully that gives you a feel that climate is, and rainfall, and, you know, that potential is a big influence here. The key thing to remember though, just like wheels on a vehicle or an engine in the engine block, you need a minimum for that sort of function. And when you go below that minimum, you are losing potential rainfall and plant available water and plant growth. That's really important. So if you're under 2%, the paddock is limited. So whatever your results are, if you're under 2%, in my opinion, you've got a problem. So you need to try and get it close to 2% organic matter. I'm not talking carbon, I'm talking organic matter, to really, you know, be anywhere near where you need to be. Even in quite low rainfall, sandy country, I think you've got to be trying to achieve 2%. The other thing just to remember before we jump on to sort of scoring and stuff and what can you do about it, is that if you've taken your soil sample and you've got bare ground between the perennial grasses, and you go out to take a soil sample, it's human nature that you're going to take the soil sample in the easy spot, i.e. between the plants. You only have to go that far from a perennial grass, that far out from it to the bare interspace, and the organic matter can be less than half it is next to the perennial grass. Does that kind of make sense? Like right under the grass and right under the tree, those trees that Jeff and Linda are sitting under, right under the tree there, the leaf fall will make the organic matter much higher than if I step away from the canopy. It can be triple times the organic matter. So when you take your sample, and that's why, you know, the grazing extension guys, when they did the grazing land management technical research, the old GLM, hopefully most of you have heard that because it was a really good project. When they did this work and they studied organic matter right at the base of the perennial grass, and then they went out and showed that it dropped off dramatically. So that's why having as many perennial plants, you know, good density is really important, but it does influence your result. So if you've gone around and just taken the interspace and you're hitting yourself over the head going, oh, my organic matter's terrible, you know, don't be too hard on yourself if you do have good perennial grasses. So with that in mind, and that's really something more relevant for you guys where you do have interplant spacing, whereas down in the Orange or the Atherton area or Orange, New South Wales, there's a lot more plant density unless the grazing is really poor. So yeah, if you're at or above your target, then obviously it's good. If you're marginal, like if you're at 1.5 to 2% organic matter, you'd say, you know, it's a bit marginal. And if you're well below it, if you're less than 1.5, you're losing potential growth yield for sure. Obviously, taking into account that interspace sampling issue that can be there. So the question is, what can I do about it? What can I do about organic matter? Should I buy Dave's magic liquid in a bottle and he'll send it up to me in the Aussie Post? No, you should just do good grazing management, and you're trying to really manage for those perennial plants in the landscape, which I don't think I'm telling you guys anything new. So yeah, maintaining good grazing management, as you can see, that really helps with the root volume and the grasses, as you saw from that trial work before, but also that density of plants. The other thing that I noticed doing some soil pits a few years ago up north of Charters Towers and inland a bit was where you've got the woodland, like here, this is near Mataranka, this picture, but where you have scattered trees, so a woodland, and there's no competition between the trees and the grass, so the grass is growing up to the trunk. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. So where you know that you've got no competition because the grass and the trees are kind of all together and you don't have bare ground around the trees, then you also get a lot more organic matter because of leaf fall from the trees. there's a couple of other benefits they do. They really increase infiltration because the large roots of trees increase the pores. So that area has a really good infiltration rate. So obviously it's a balance between trees and grass, I understand that, but they definitely really help enhance productivity as long as you keep that balance, and especially organic matter and water dynamics there, and nutrient cycling as well, that kind of thing. But you will see a higher level in that. And we did some trenches under the canopy of a tree, and then about 20 metres out in between trees where there was no trees, and it was chalk and cheese, the organic matter and the root volume. It was quite amazing, actually. So yeah, just think about those things when you're sampling as well, because obviously you're picking a site. Is it representative?
Just on that,
So yes,
on that
Anne, go for it.
topic, David,
Yep.
if you look at one of Luke's samples, he's got 2 samples there, and we've
Yep.
taken one just in
Yep.
Grass Downs, and then he went and took a sample directly in underneath the prickly acacia, just to compare.
Yep. Which one's that? Which 2 of those?
So if you look
yep.
at, so it's samples 2 and 3. So 3
yeah,
under the
H
prickly
and I.
acacia.
Yep. So there's a little bit more organic matter, not a great deal. Yeah.
No.
Yep. But yeah, generally where there's more leaf fall, as long as there's grass growing, if it's just bare ground with leaf fall, you probably wouldn't see that increase effect, I think. But it's something to keep an eye on for sure. So what can you do? Grazing management, obviously, really trying to encourage your perennials. Scattered trees are good as long as you've got that tree grass balance. They've got that benefit. And if you're doing hay paddocks like this one here at north of Charters, it's really difficult. Even though it's a perennial grass, it's quite tricky to build organic matter because you're cutting that for hay so short all the time. So the grass never builds a root system. And there's a couple of other things going on there. They're putting out a lot of nitrogen, which is just making the bacteria go ballistic, and then they just breathe off all the carbon into the air. It's pretty much hyperventilating, so it's very hard to lift organic matter. The problem with those hay paddocks, if you've got them going with the pivot irrigator and you're loading them up with fertilizer and you're doing all those things I've described, is that because they've got low organic matter, their water efficiency is really poor. It takes forever for water to infiltrate because they've got no structure left. And so your pumping costs go up. And the way you solve all of these problems is you chuck on more fertilizer, which all it does is you get on a bandwagon. So it's a bit like, solving an addiction with more of the same thing. And you just get caught in a cycle. And the problem is water and nutrient efficiency is really low. So you just get stuck on that really, and the pumping costs can be problematic. So just something to be mindful of if you are doing forage crops. Are there any burning questions at this point? I'm mindful that we're covering a bit of ground, but hopefully I've sort of got the message over that organic matter is really, really important. Benchmarking it is tricky because you have to be a bit relevant to your climate and land use. But if you're under 2% organic matter, not carbon, and some people talk carbon, so you've got to be careful, then I'd suggest to you that you've definitely got an issue. And if you're on the better or the more fertile, heavier textured soils, I'd suggest to you that you need to be aiming for that 3% plus in grazing landscapes. Aiming towards that 3%. Whereas if you're in cropping, if you're below 2%, you're not getting your bang for buck for water and nutrient management. All right, I'll keep rolling, but feel free to pull me up if you need to. Yes, go for it. Yeah, Rowan.
Just an observation.
Yep.
At one of the Wombiana field days there, they were saying that conkleberry bushes are extremely good for upping the infiltration of water.
Yep.
Have you heard that before?
Yeah, look, I haven't. I don't know the vegetation, because I'm not a local, I don't know it as well as, probably some of the local guys. I do know, and I did the initial grazing land management training when they first rolled it out. I was working in southern Queensland, and I do remember, because we had a pretty in-depth training on it as extension staff, and saw all the research and stuff. And from what I've seen doing infiltration rates too, where you have scattered trees, definitely, and you see this down here in southern Australia too, scattered eucalypts, unless cows or something is camping under them and keeping them compacted, you normally always get much higher infiltration rate. So there are exceptions, like where it's bare ground, you won't. You know how sometimes some trees just have bare ground around them for whatever reason. That'll be worse. But if it's, if it's healthy and there's just occasional grazing under there, usually because the larger roots of the trees and the shrubs mean there's more pore space. And you can actually look at the Grazing Land Management technical manual that they did, sort of all the research they did behind that, because they did the trial work, which was really impressive. But yeah, that's a general rule. But of course, you've got to balance it with shading and water competition too, I guess, Ryan. So, it is a balancing act. But hopefully that gives you a bit of an answer. Yeah, so Roger, it's okay, so it's a good question, Roger. I can't give you a black and white one. What I can say is that there's two things going on with water. There's how quickly and how well it infiltrates. That's the first thing, infiltration rate. And the second thing is how much is then held in a plant available form in the storage bucket in your topsoil. So there's two parts to the water story. So the first one is infiltration rate, and the second one we call pore or plant available water. Pore is in dog paw. So they're the two parts to it, and organic matter helps with both. What I can tell you is that the plant available water storage goes up, and you see different research, but if the argument is, or one of the research numbers is, for every 1 gram of carbon, you get about 8 grams of water storage from soil organic matter. So every 1 gram, you get 8 grams of, so it's an eightfold increase in water holding capacity. The infiltration's a little bit different because that depends on the different pores. I won't go into it too much, but there's large and medium and small pores in your soil. And so it does depend a bit on types of porosity. But what we know, if you think about it, if you're building, if you're laying pipe for water, stock water points, if you go from a 1-inch pipe to a 2-inch pipe, you don't just double the water distribution. It's 10 to the power of 4. Like, it's a much bigger, to go from 1 inch to 2 inch is not just double the water flow, it's multiple times. Yeah. And that's the same with pores in the soil. If I go from a few pores to just a few more, it's not just double the water infiltration, it's multiple times. And that's why over 3 years, you can go from 1 mil or 6 mil to 60 mil. It's because of that physics of pore, of what do you want to call it? The tube size, or whatever the technical term is. And that's the same in soils, just like pumping water from a 1 inch to a 2 inch. So if you're putting water pipes out, don't pick 1 inch, as you know, because you're not going to get the 2 inch. For a little bit more money, you get a lot more delivery of water. And it's the same in soils. But yeah, so 1 gram to 8 is something that some of the CSIRO guys talk about. But it's a significant increase in plant available water, put it that way. And the dry tropics have been doing quite a lot of work. Dry tropics NRM there near the coast, or where you are tonight, Roger, and Charters. And, some of those graziers have really got phenomenal change in the water cycle over 5 years. It's been quite dramatic what they've seen. So some of that work's been done by dry tropics. Okay, so I'll keep going. We'll probably only do this one last thing. We won't worry about pH tonight, but hopefully you're getting a feel that there's a bit of a checklist, and for grazing landscapes, I'm going through the 2 most important ones. There are a couple of others that we can touch on next week or the week after, but let's just jump onto this one. So the other key thing on your checklist that's related to organic matter is something called the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So I know it's 8:30 and Jeff's on his second beer, but I'm just going to try and crack it. So let's keep going a bit. So it's not only the quantity of organic matter that's important in the soil, it's also the quality. So it's a little bit like feed for animals. If you think about it, you've got a paddock of feed and you go, all right, I've got a fairly big bulk of feed here, but what's the quality? What's the protein content? So I'm pretty sure everyone's happy with that kind of quality and quantity. So it's the same in the soil. You can have plenty of organic matter in the soil, but is the quality reasonable? And just like when you're feeding a ruminant animal like a cow, if the organic matter that the cow's eating or the biomass is not digestible to the microbes in the rumen, the cow won't survive very well. So it's the same in the soil, because it's all the microbes in the soil that start to eat your soil organic matter. So if it's too woody, then they break it down really slowly. And if it's too too much nitrogen in it, they break it down too quickly. So it's a little bit like feed for animals. So it's not only quantity that's important, it's quality. And this here, if you have a look carefully, it's really hard to take photos of soils. But if you have a look, this is a forest soil in the Grampians in Western Victoria. And you can see it's basically a forest. It's a roadside forest, and it's just litter. There's no grass really. There's just that one plant. The rest of it, so for most of its last 20 years or 30, 40 years, it's just been leaf litter. And you can, if you look really carefully, you can actually see the fine roots of the trees all through that. It's completely full of roots. You can see them coming out the bottom here. So when you shake it, it's just full of roots, but it's also full of this big layer of organic matter. But notice how that organic matter is really woody. So there's not much protein in it. It's quite high in lignin. I don't know if any of you guys have seen Dick Richardson talk. Dick gives those field days, and he gets down and starts smelling the soil and gets everyone smelling the litter layer, smelling for fungal activity. And so that's his way of sort of explaining too much lignin in the organic matter. So the quality is important. If it's too woody, if there's too much carbon or lignin, it will slow down nutrient cycling. Just like if you feed a cow hardwood sawdust, the rumen can't break it down in time. So the cow's going to fall over. It just can't access nutrients. It's breaking down in that rumen way too slow. So in the soil can deal with hardwood, but it does it really slowly. That's the difference with soils and rumens. So it will break it down, but it's too slow for grass. So for you guys, the key thing is if you get too much woody thickening and no more grass, and you get a lot of bark and leaf and stem and twig fall, you'll end up skewing the quality of your organic matter to be a little bit too woody. The other time it'll happen is in buffel grass that starts to decline because there's no nitrogen around. So when you lose the nitrogen out of a landscape, 30 years after clearing some mulga country and there's no legumes coming back, well, all the nitrogen's been used up. You just get that rank lignin grass, the whole show starts to decline. So that's an example of too woody in the soil organic matter. It'll slow things down. And the opposite is if it's too hot. So think of chicken manure when you're handling fresh chicken manure. Some of you might handle that. It smells of ammonium. That's nitrogen. It's got too much nitrogen for its carbon. So it's what we call hot. And you guys don't probably have this problem, but down here on a dairy farm in spring with lots of green feed, the feed goes straight through the animal. It's too digestible. So that's the same thing. It's too digestible. It's too much nitrogen. And that's what happens on these hay paddocks up your way when they put too much nitrogen on them. They're just too hot. And so the organic matter has got too much nitrogen in the soil and it just breaks it down super fast and you lose all your carbon back to the air, basically. It's a bit of a disaster. So the way you measure your soil's organic matter's quality, do I have a reasonable balance in my organic matter, is what's called the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So, and it's really important because it influences the speed of cycling in your soil. So you can find it on your soil test. If you've got your soil test there, I'll get yours up. It's on about sort of near the total carbon. If you remember that total carbon on the second page or down towards the bottom, you'll see this thing called the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So that's the number you're looking for. Just think of it as the quality of my organic matter. Just like when you're looking at forage for a cow, going, what's the quality like? Is there enough protein in it, or is it too much protein, or is it heaps of lignin and not enough nitrogen? So that's what we're looking at. And you can see the different numbers. So this first one is 26 to 1, 26 carbon for every 1 nitrogen. The second one is 13 to 1. The third one is 17 to 1, and so on. So hopefully you guys have been able to see that on your soil test, the ratio of carbon to nitrogen. So if I just break that down a little bit more, that first soil, this number G, whoever that is, I think it might be one of Luke's. So if we go up, so your soil, Luke, has an organic matter content in that soil of 4.4 in that soil there, and the quality of that organic matter is 26 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. So it's quite high in carbon, or it's quite woody, that makes sense. And does everyone see this next soil has 13:1 is its quality, and its actual amount of organic matter is 1. So it has a smaller amount of organic matter and the quality is different. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Let me try and clear it up or explain it a little bit more by going back to our presentation. So hopefully you can see that that's another number irrelevant to your organic matter. So the question is, of course, what's a good number? Once you've found it, well, is that ratio 26:1 good or 13:1? What's a good number? So this is the key, because if I'm outside that ratio, the soil will be, the organic matter in your soil is too woody. It'll slow down the system. And so that's the benchmark. This is a general benchmark for pretty much across the world for agricultural soils, between 10:1 and 20:1. So as long as your soil's organic matter's carbon to nitrogen ratio is between 10:1 and 20:1, it will be cycling its nutrients relatively well. It will be breaking down and cycling nutrients for you, the soil community. As soon as you go over 20:1, it's getting too woody. It's getting too woody. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So Luke, that first paddock that we looked at on your test, at 26 to, you've got lots of organic matter, 4.4% organic matter. It's really high for your region, but your quality of it is too woody for grasses. It's 26:1. So it's higher than 20:1. It's not super woody, but it's a bit high. So it'll still be cycling its nutrients, but it'll be a little bit slower than probably some other areas. Does that kind of make sense to everyone? And that's one of the reasons why thickening timber, or, you know, when country goes back to woodland and especially back to forest, you get a lot more high lignin, bark, and so it shuts down the system. So it's not just shade. Shade's a part of it, and shades out the grasses, and water competition between grass and tree. They're definitely part of it. But the third problem when you get timber thickening too far is you get too much carbon in the organic matter. It gets too woody in the soil organic matter, and it slows down nutrient cycling. And so that's the third thing to keep an eye out for. So we look for that on the soil test with the C/N ratio. A bit like a carburettor. Exactly, Roger. You got it in one, mate. If I was mechanical, I'll use that. Thanks for giving me that. And so if I have a look at some other examples for you guys, let's have a look at that soil at the Atherton tablelands, the high rainfall soil. You can see that the ratio up there is 13:1. So, yep, it's fine. It's not too woody, not too hot. And I'll show you a couple of examples where it isn't in an ideal situation. This one here. So these are 9 soils. I did introduce you to these soils last time when we looked at totals. I showed you soils from a vanilla paddock and different things. And so if you have a look at what we've measured on these 9 soils is their organic matter, but also their carbon to nitrogen ratio. And this one here, number 3, is a grazing paddock in the tablelands of New South Wales. It's got heaps of organic matter, 6.8%, but it's got a carbon to nitrogen ratio of nearly 40:1. So just think of an old buffel grass paddock that's in serious decline, full of lignin. Cows don't get anything off it. There's no legumes. There's no soil nitrogen. It's starting to turn to what we'd almost call a forest type organic matter. It's really slow. And Dick Richardson would be smelling it going, it smells like fungi, because it's just too lignified, that landscape. So that's an example for you of soil shutting down, topsoil grazing paddock shutting down. And here we've got that vanilla paddock. If everyone remembers that vanilla paddock, and that has 28% organic matter. And you saw a picture of it before. It's a nice dark chocolate, but you can see the carbon and nitrogen ratio is still within a reasonable balance. So that soil is still cycling the nutrients for the horticulture crop for vanilla. It hasn't shut it down. So there's just some other examples for you. And this one here, last one, is number 4. That's a Rhodes grass irrigated pivot with the Rhodes grass hay production. It's only got 1% organic matter, and it's under 10:1, so it's got too much nitrogen. And they keep chucking on urea, and it just keeps it's hyperventilating. It's going too quickly, like that dairy cow in Victoria. That's the feed's just going straight through the animal, and you get a lot of agronomic problems in that situation. So I know I've covered it. It's sort of a bit of a technical issue, C to N ratio, but it's like the carburetor. It's regulating nutrient cycling. It regulates nutrient cycling to a great extent, as well as air and roots do as well, and and structure. But this is another key driver of that soil. So just be mindful of it. It's not common to go outside the range in most agricultural landscapes, but if you've got woody thickening, then just be wary that that might be part of your problem. So it'd be interesting to know, Luke, what's going on where you took that sample from, because it's definitely on the higher end of things. Probably is not really performing really poorly, because there's a bit of flexibility in biology. But yeah, if you were getting over 30 to 1, I'd be pretty concerned that it's looking woody, getting too woody. So yeah, have a look at yours, benchmark it like we've been doing. Are you in a good range? Are you outside your range, or are you marginal? What can you do about it? Well, what can you do about it in a grazing landscape? Try to get more, well, if you've got too much woody thickening, then obviously open up the country a little bit. But the other thing to do is get grazing pressure, so you don't get lignified old grass. And to stop pasture decline, you need to get some legumes back in there to get some nitrogen going in that topsoil. So once the nitrogen's in there, you get a protein to energy ratio back to normal. So yeah, grazing management and legumes are two of the big things, and just keeping country open. Yeah, so that's the main way you can modify it. Are there any, and so, last thing, this is a sugarcane paddock. So the guys have this same challenge, and this is a cover crop where they're growing 4 different legumes in the cane rotation. And the reason that he's doing that is to put nitrogen in the soil organic matter so he can use less fertilizer. So if he has a good ratio in his soil organic matter of nitrogen, he can get that nitrogen cycling to his cane crop, and he doesn't need as much fertilizer. And this is a guy called Alan Lynn. Alan's dropped his nitrogen fertilizer use from 180 units of nitrogen or kilos of nitrogen to 120, and his yield has gone up. Yeah, so Roger, Seco-Stylo helping the C to N ratio, exactly correct, because it's a legume bringing in nitrogen. Yep, and as long as that woodland is a woodland, because as soon as the trees, of course, get too close, it becomes an open forest. And the definition of a woodland is scattered trees with lots of grass. So as long as it's staying like that, then yeah, that silo is probably keeping a really good balance for you. But it's, yeah, and that's why they're so important to have some legumes around. Okay, so if there's any other questions, feel free to throw them in. I might actually pull it up at this point. The last thing that we can look at on a soil test is pH for tonight. So I'll really quickly do that. And so I'll just skip a few slides. We'll go to this one. So the last thing quickly to have a look at is your pH. And your pH, I won't go too long on it, but it's near the top of your test. You'll see the pH number there. So if you look sort of the top third of your test, you'll find the pH. And then you can see the first soil is 8.5, then the next soil is 8.2, 7, 8.9. So just to refresh pH, the pH scale goes from 0 to 14. And yeah, Luke, what I mean by woody is high carbon. So not much nitrogen floating around, and more lignin. So more complex carbon, so bark, but even in the soil, you just got a lot more carbon to the protein content. That's sort of how I use that term woody, if that makes sense. And it kind of matches above ground woody material too, but it just means a high proportion of carbon in your organic matter and not enough nitrogen. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. It's a bit like feeding cows just rank grass that doesn't have enough protein content. So yeah, that's the scale, 0 to 14 for your pH. And 7 is neutral. 7 is neutral. And for most of you guys in that part of the world, over 8 or over 7 is very normal. So alkaline soils are the rule in semi-arid areas. And so you guys, it's very normal to have high pHs. whereas elsewhere in Australia, like sugarcane fields and down south, acidity is more common, like 5 and 6 pH and 4 pH. So you guys naturally have alkaline or above 7 pHs, which is fine. All the vegetation has adapted to that. The only reason, well, one of the main reasons why pH is kind of important for you guys to just be aware of is if you're sowing legumes. So I've just skipped that. I've just covered that. So I've got a general target, but it's not really relevant for grazing landscapes. So the key thing about pH is if you've got a grazing landscape, you're not going to change it. You're not going to go out and put lime or do something crazy like that unless you really got a big checkbook and you just won the lottery. So the question is, you just got to match your vegetation to your soil type. But the time when pH is important is when you're thinking to sow legumes, because different legumes have different tolerances of pH. So always match your legume to the pH of the soil type. Hopefully that makes sense. So sometimes people sow a new legume into pasture and it doesn't go well, and one of the reasons could be that it didn't like that pH. So if you were farming, you'd just change the pH, but you're not. So you just have to make sure that your legume species matches the soil type's pH. So just be aware of that. Most of what you guys are trialing up there, the stylos and the Wincassias and stuff, they're usually fairly, or that's a bit further south than you, they're usually fairly adapted to the higher pHs, but just be aware of that. Desmanthus, it's adapted, as I understand it, to a higher pH. But if you've got a neutral soil, yeah, just be aware of that when you are considering sowing legumes. Just check with the supplier, the seed supplier, and just check your pH. So that's pH. So I'll pull it up. So obviously you can see there's a couple of other things on the soil health. Roger, it won't over the whole landscape. Roger's question is, will a legume change the pH? It will down here in southern Australia in high rainfall, Roger, where you have, say you have clover in a pasture at about 15-20% of the pasture mix, you can get acidification happening. I won't go into it. There's a technical process where you get excess nitrogen in the soil and you create acidity. But up your way, unless you've got a pure stand of legume in, say, a hay paddock, and you're using nitrogen fertilizer, which would be crazy from an agronomic point of view. If you've got a legume going, they get their own nitrogen, but people have done crazy things. So at the density of legumes that you guys have in your landscapes, I wouldn't think it changes the overall pH. It may modify it around the root zone, but that's just a natural thing the plant's doing to optimize its nutrients. So hopefully, Roger, that gives you an answer. But thick, like constantly growing legumes over a long time does tend to lower the pH a little bit in some cases, especially in higher rainfall areas. So we've covered two of the really big things that are really important for grazing landscapes: organic matter / carbon, and carbon to nitrogen ratio. And I've also touched on pH. The other thing that can be an issue in some of your soils, which I'll just remind you of it, but if you want to cover it, we've got an extra webinar we can do, is some areas have really high sodium exchanging, and they what we call sodic soils. So that really high eroding, they're really erodible country around the Triple B catchment, Collinsville area. The problem with that soil is that it's really high in sodium, and sodium destroys soil structure. That's why they get all that really bad erosion issues. And well, one of the reasons is it can be a high sodium soil. And the other thing that some soils have in your region of Australia is they can be really high in salts. And I saw that when I was up your way in 2017, and we went to a property near Julia Creek, whose name I wouldn't remember, but Anne would know where it was. And after the field day, we went to the homestead because the garden was dead, and they wanted me to go and have a look at it. So we rocked up, and they were watering it heaps, the nice lawn and all the new shrubs, and it was dead as a dodo. And the reason was that the groundwater was full of salts. So it was increasing the soil salinity. Jeff and Linda, as long as you're between 10-1 and 20-25 to 1, it's all good. So yeah, I wouldn't, whether it's 11, it's not like higher isn't better. It's as long as it's in that range. That's the main thing. High is not better, too low is not better. As long as you're in that between those two numbers or thereabouts, it doesn't matter if it varies. It's only when you go above 25 towards 30 to 1 that you should be worried, or if it goes under 10 to 1, 8 to 1, which is not going to do in your landscape. But yeah, so but if you saw your organic matter go up like that, Linda, then you'd definitely get excited. The actual quantity go up, yes. Like if your percent organic matter went from 2 to 4, you'd go on YouTube and you'd be a sensation. Yes. Okay, so John, how high is sodium? When it's high and a problem is about 6 to 10%. So I'm happy to briefly, quickly show you. I'm mindful of not just overloading you guys, but overloading my brain too. But we can come back to it. But it's on your soil test at this area of your soil test about 2/3 of the way down where you've got these percentages. So you look on your soil test for this area where there's these percentages of calcium, magnesium, potassium. Without going too much into it, the key one that you're looking at is, of course, sodium. It's also called exchangeable sodium percent. That's why it's called ESP. And if you go over about 6%, like this one here, John, then that's definitely a potential issue. It's a potential issue. So any soil where you're seeing 6 to 10% or higher, so just south of Charters Towers, there's a mine. Some of you'd know that mine down just south of town there. And those guys were in a soil program that we just finished. And they had sodium at 30% on some of their eroding hills. So you can see that's really high. So if you do have sodium percentage, that's what you're looking for, that percentage sodium over 6 to 10%. There's one at 10%. Then potentially you have a problem. You don't always get it expressed, because if you have good organic matter and ground cover and vegetation, it can moderate it. The problem with sodic soils is when you expose them or overgraze them and they start to erode, you're gone. They're very hard to get back because the plants don't like growing when the sodium's causing problem. So if you have a high 10% soil, I don't know whose soil this one is, and that's Abbotsford 3, the shed paddock. So if that's got good grass cover on it, don't overgraze it and get it bare and exposed, because that's when the sodium will start to cause you can start to cause erosion problems. So it can be an issue. It's usually a hotspot issue in certain areas in that part of the world, but just be mindful of it. And that's why our tax money is going to try and save those triple B catchments, because they're eroding away and all the sediments going to the reef, and it's because of sodium. So instead of blaming the graziers, we've got to blame the sodium. So yeah, it's just a sodic soil. And once they lose their ground cover and native vegetation or perennial grasses, they're very problematic. Okay, so there's a few things there, but hopefully I've given you a bit of a feel for assessing soil health. So I'll pull it up now because we've gone a little bit over time, but you can see soil health's a bit of a topic. But the really last thing I just really want to mention is that you can't get the full story of a soil's condition off a soil test. You have to go out in the paddock and have a look. Do I have ground cover and litter? Do I have good soil structure? Is the surface not sealing? Is there good root depth? Do I have that perennial plant coverage? Is there good density of perennial grasses? You've got to look at everything. So just because the sodium's high on the test or the organic matter's a bit low on the test, if the paddock's going okay when you look at it in the field, then, you've got to look at things holistically. But if you're at 1% organic matter, then, you've got to look at ways to try and improve that density of pasture and ground cover and get things moving as best you can. So what we've done today is used a soil test to check soil health and particularly look at organic matter and carbon to nitrogen ratio, or the carburetor of your soil, organic matter, and hopefully that then helps you kind of just make some more decisions around your soil management. So if there's no other burning questions, and feel free to throw them in now if you do have them, just send them through to Anne or on the chat, or send them an email to her and we can follow them up. And next time we meet, I think I've finished the thing. Next time we meet, I'll stop sharing. We're going to explore a little bit on nutrients. So in particular, phosphorus and sulfur, just to sort of practice using a soil test to assess fertility and are nutrients limiting my production. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks, everyone. Jeff only had one beer. I think that's well done, Jeff. Maybe two. Yeah, you've done well, because I think one group, he was knocking back a few, which I don't blame him, because we were talking CEC. No worries, Luke. Yeah, so thanks, everyone, for making the effort, and we'll see you next week. But any questions, feel free to throw them up.
Anyone got any questions?
David?
Yes.
Yeah, David from Rowan.
Yes, Ron.
Have you got that soil health checklist page there again?
I do. Hang on a minute. I'll get it back up. Which, just a little checklist? Yep.
Yeah, just the list, yeah.
Yep. Hang on a minute. I'll find it if I can. No, won't let me do it. I'll have to send it through to you, but I'll get it through to Anne, and she can send it to you.
Very good.
Yep. No worries.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's all right. Sorry, I just can't get that PowerPoint to go backwards. So, sorry. Yep. I'll get that to Anne for you.
Thanks, David.
No worries.
Righto. Well, thanks, everybody. No one else has got any questions?
There's one on there on fire. Yeah, Roger, there's been quite a lot of research on that the last year or two, especially, but even the last 10 years. It depends on the temperature of the fire, obviously, cool burning versus hot burning. That's the same with everything. And really hot burns will burn soil organic matter. And so you will lose some of your organic matter in a really hot burn. Even in a cool burn, you'll lose a little bit. The benefit of a cool burn is it kind of releases all the nutrients from the organic matter, like the minerals. That's why you get a flush of growth, just because, as I said, organic matter contains carbon and nutrients. So particularly the minerals, potash, gets released when you burn. So it's kind of like instant breakdown and release of nutrients, basically. But a hot fire will cook, will crust the topsoil, and then you've got all those problems of high temperature, no plant growth, runoff, excess runoff, and yeah, the bacteria will come back, but some of the overall soil function, takes a while to come back. Just like if you plow soil too much, it takes a few years for it to sort of come back to semi health. A hot fire will knock it back for sure, just like it knocks back vegetation. So yeah, it definitely has an effect. But cool burning, yeah, no, don't have a problem as long as it's not too often. Yeah, I think it's a good sort of disturbance every now and again. I know some people hate burning, and grazing's probably as good a way to do it as any other, but if you need to burn, then yeah, there's a place for it, I guess.
David, is there a depth that you shouldn't plough to?
It depends a little bit on the soil type. So as you know, some soils, they change. The topsoil and the subsoil are different. And so if you're going to open country up for cropping, then the best thing to do is to actually see if it has there's two sort of general terms: gradational, where it's fairly similar or down to 80 centimeters, or does it change abruptly? So is there a duplex, we call it? So if you've got a soil that has a very distinct change in chemistry, like at 10, 20 centimeters or whatever, it's a good idea to check that, because sometimes that soil is very problematic, and you do not want to be ploughing into it and mixing it. Whereas other times it's quite safe. So as a general rule, if it's a fairly uniform soil, like the Mitchell Grass Downs is quite uniform for quite a while in most areas, you're quite safe. But if you've got two layers, I'd get a test on the second layer. Things like sodium or pH change, or there's other issues on the coast they get, and that can cause you big problems. Yeah, so you just don't want to be mixing subsoil up into your topsoil most of the time. Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't help. And if you have that kind of soil type, it will hold back crops. So you might think, oh, it looks pretty good, and the crop grows to a certain point and then just stops, and that's telling you that there's a problem in the subsoil. And as soon as the roots hit it, they just go, can't grow anymore. But yeah, just do a bit of due diligence, especially if you're spending money to open country up. Like you're putting a lot of effort in. couple of $100 on a soil test or 2 soil tests and get out there with a backhoe or a post hole digger and just check it out. It's, you know, it's nothing compared to what problems you might have and curse later on. Yeah.
Righto. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Anyone else? John, you're very quiet and you've got your phone, actually, your audio works tonight.
Can I just ask you another question in regards to some of these numbers on our results?
Yep.
There's one paddock which we've got, we've had desmanthus planted in, or different types of desmanthus planted in there for over 10 years.
Yep.
And I just see the carbon to nitrogen ratio
Yep.
in that paddock is 19.
Yep.
And the organic matter is 2.9, which is like the highest of any of our paddocks.
Yep.
But is that carbon to nitrogen ratio getting too high? Because it says we're at 10 to 12.
Yeah, no. So, thanks for bringing that up. As far as that's one of the few areas where I don't think you should use the EAL benchmark. The 10 to 12 is a very textbook benchmark based on humus, pure humus, and it doesn't. If you read, because of my job, I read lots of other soil technical books, and I've seen a lot of paddocks over 20-year career, and there's actually there's a biological reason for that 20-25 to 1, and the reason is that when you go over that, microbes, the bacteria don't have enough nitrogen. So once you go over 20 to 1, 25 to 1, bacteria, they don't have enough protein, so they will stop. Fungi will keep going. Fungi will break it down, but they're very slow, and so you shut the paddock down. But bacteria shut down. It's a bit like rumen. There's a certain point protein content and you go under that and the rumen just doesn't function well. So it's the same. So if you think 20-25 to 1, there's a little bit of leeway. So 19 to 1, I wouldn't be concerned, especially if you've got progrades in there or legumes in there. And it's a biological system, so there's a bit of flexibility. But it's a good point, because the EAL 10 to 12 to 1 is actually it's probably not a good benchmark to put in there. It's a good test and lab, but that's the one thing I'd strongly disagree with them on. Because you'll see really well performing paddocks at 20 to 1 and 10 to 1. So it's a threshold. Yeah.
So with your strength, that last sample I took there in just in Mount Pollux, it's got your actual highest organic matter, which I thought was interesting. And that's the area just out of the grass. That's in your little Pebbly area. And I thought it might have had the higher organic matter because it was full country. But when you look down at the C to N ratio, it's not as high as what I thought that might have been high.
Oh.
Yeah. So you can have lots of organic matter but not a big ratio, which means the organic matter is really actively cycling, or you can have a little bit of organic matter that's quite woody when it's got a high C to N ratio. So it's they don't always correlate, but as long as you're under that 20-25 to 1, you won't have any worries as far as the soil cycling its nutrients fairly steadily.
Righto, very good. Well, thank you. You happy, Frank? Any more questions? Righto. Thank you very much, David. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us. Yep.
Righto. Good night all. So we'll be same time next week. And then the fourth one for the Hughenden group. I'm going to be away on the road doing the soil erosion control workshops and property visits, so we'll have to just delay that last one for this group. But that'll be the really interesting one where we go through everyone's soil test, sample by sample, and really work out, what you're trying to achieve by them. So, so that'll be really interesting. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. Good night. Thanks, David. Really appreciate your time. We've
See you, everyone.
taken everyone over. Good night all.